The gap between staying broke forever and building real wealth is smaller than most people realize. It is not your salary. It is not your education. It is not your zip code or your connections or whether you were born into money. It comes down to one specific threshold, a number so small that most people dismiss it as insignificant, and so powerful that once you cross it, the entire arithmetic of your financial life changes permanently. That number is $10,000. I am going to show you exactly why that number matters, exactly what changes when you cross it, and exactly what is standing between most people and that threshold right now in 2026. But before I give you the number that explains everything, I need to tell you something about myself that the financial industry does not want you to hear from someone in my position. I am Ray Dalio. I built Bridgewater Associates into the largest hedge fund in the world, managing over $124 billion. I have advised central banks, governments, and some of the wealthiest families on the planet. I predicted the 2008 financial crisis 18 months before it happened. I navigated the dot-com crash, the 1987 collapse, every major debt cycle and monetary transition for the last 50 years. I have studied wealth creation across 500 years of economic history, and I am telling you right now that the single most important financial lesson I have ever learned did not come from any of that. It came from the worst moment of my career. In 1982, I sat alone in an empty office. I had just made the most catastrophically wrong public prediction of my life. I had told everyone who would listen that a debt crisis was coming that would dwarf anything since the Great Depression. I was certain, I was confident, I was the smartest guy in the room, and I was completely wrong. The market went up, the economy boomed, my clients left, my reputation was destroyed, and I had to call my father and ask him to lend me $4,000 just to pay my family's bills. That moment, sitting in that empty office with nothing, taught me something that 50 years of subsequent success never could. The difference between people who build lasting wealth and people who never escape financial struggle is not intelligence. It is not timing. It is not access to information that other people do not have. It is understanding one specific mathematical threshold and what happens on either side of it. I did not understand that threshold when I was building Bridgewater. I was already wealthy before I understood it clearly, and that is why I am telling you about it now. Because if I had understood it at 25, everything would have been different faster. Stay with me, because what I am about to show you changes the way you think about money permanently. Here is the number, $10,000, specifically $10,000 of investable capital that is not earmarked for any immediate expense, not your emergency fund, not your rent, not next month's bills. $10,000 that is genuinely available to be put to work. I want to show you why that specific number is the threshold at which the arithmetic of wealth creation changes fundamentally. And I want to do it with math, not motivation, because motivation fades. Math does not. If you have $0 to invest and you save $300 per month, it takes you 33 months to accumulate $10,000. 33 months of discipline before the threshold is crossed. But here is what changes when you cross it. At $10,000 invested in assets, generating an average annual return of 8%, you earn $800 per year in returns. That is $66 per month that your money generates without you doing anything. It sounds small. It is not small. Here is why. That $66 per month reduces the time required to save your next $10,000 from 33 months to 28 months. And the $10,000 after that takes 24 months. And the $10,000 after that takes 20 months. The acceleration is not linear. It is exponential. And it becomes self-sustaining at a specific point that most people never reach because they do not understand the math well enough to push through the early stages. The threshold at $10,000 is the beginning of the acceleration curve. Before it, you are pushing a boulder uphill with no mechanical advantage. After it, the boulder begins to help you push. Now, I want to be direct with you about something that most financial content completely avoids. The reason most people never cross this threshold has nothing to do with their income. I have studied this pattern across hundreds of wealth-building cases over my career. People with modest incomes cross it regularly. People with substantial incomes never cross it. The difference is not how much money comes in. It is what happens to the money between coming in and potentially being saved. And there are 4 specific mechanisms that prevent most people from ever accumulating $10,000 of genuinely investable capital. Understanding these mechanisms is the first step toward defeating them. The first mechanism is lifestyle inflation. Every time income increases, expenses increase to match. This is not irresponsible behavior in most cases. It is a rational response to a financial system that makes consumption extremely easy and saving extraordinarily difficult. The subscription services, the credit card rewards, the 0% financing on everything, the one-click purchasing, every piece of that system is designed by extremely intelligent people to extract money from your account before it can accumulate. The counterintuitive truth I discovered studying wealth builders is that the ones who cross the $10,000 threshold fastest do not necessarily earn more. They automate the extraction of savings before lifestyle inflation can consume it. The moment the paycheck arrives, a fixed amount leaves for the savings vehicle before any spending decision is made, not after. Before. The mechanism that enables lifestyle inflation operates on discretionary spending decisions. Remove the discretion, and you remove the mechanism. The second mechanism is what I call the emergency fund trap. Most financial advice tells you to build an emergency fund of 3 to 6 months of expenses before investing anything. This is correct advice for the wrong reason, delivered in a way that keeps most people in a holding pattern forever. Here is what actually happens. You save your emergency fund. You have an emergency. You spend the emergency fund. You save it again. You have another emergency. You spend it again. This cycle can repeat for years, decades, an entire working life. The problem is that emergencies are not actually random events with predictable spacing. They are continuous. Unexpected expenses arrive constantly. If your emergency fund strategy requires you to fully replenish it before investing anything, you will almost never invest anything. The correct approach, which I have seen work across hundreds of cases, is parallel accumulation. You build your emergency fund and your investable capital simultaneously, even if the contributions are unequal. A small but consistent flow into investable assets while the emergency fund builds prevents the complete restart cycle that keeps most people below the threshold indefinitely. The third mechanism is debt servicing. This is where I want to say something that contradicts a significant portion of popular financial advice. Not all debt is equally damaging to your ability to cross the $10,000 threshold. High-interest consumer debt, credit cards specifically, is a mathematical certainty of wealth destruction. Every dollar servicing 22% credit card debt is a dollar that cannot contribute to crossing the threshold. The math is unambiguous. Before investing a single dollar beyond your employer match, eliminate high-interest consumer debt. This is not a value judgment about borrowing. It is arithmetic. A guaranteed 22% return from eliminating a credit card balance is better than any investment return I have ever generated at Bridgewater. But mortgage debt, student loan debt at reasonable rates, even car loans at current market rates are different. They do not prevent threshold crossing if managed correctly. The mistake most people make is treating all debt identically and either avoiding all investment until all debt is eliminated, which can take a lifetime, or ignoring debt servicing in a way that makes investment impossible. The correct hierarchy is eliminate high-interest consumer debt first, then parallel accumulate across emergency reserves and investable capital simultaneously. The fourth mechanism is the most psychologically challenging and the one I almost never see discussed honestly in mainstream financial content. It is the belief that $10,000 is too small to matter. I encounter this constantly. People who have $300 or $500 or $2,000 in savings, who believe that the amount is too small to bother investing because the returns will be negligible. This belief is exactly backwards. At $2,000, the returns are small in absolute terms. Correct. But the discipline of treating that $2,000 as the beginning of the threshold rather than as an insufficient amount is the difference between crossing the threshold and never crossing it. The account that starts at $2,000 and receives consistent monthly additions reaches $10,000. The account that is spent because the returns at current balance are negligible never reaches $10,000. The threshold is not crossed in a single deposit. It is crossed through 100 small decisions made correctly over a sustained period. And every one of those decisions is easier if you understand that you are not building a small account. You are building the foundation of the acceleration curve. Now I want to talk about the current environment specifically, because the threshold of $10,000 carries a different weight in 2026 than it did in previous decades. And understanding why requires understanding the macro environment that is operating on your savings, whether you are aware of it or not. The United States government currently pays over $1 trillion per year in interest on its national debt. The government spends $7 trillion annually and collects $5 trillion. That $2 trillion annual gap is not an abstraction. It is the primary driver of the inflation that is currently reducing the purchasing power of every dollar you save. Let me show you what this means in practical terms for someone trying to cross the $10,000 threshold. If true inflation, the actual cost of living increase most Americans experience when you include housing, food, energy, and healthcare, is running at 6 to 7% annually, then a savings account earning 4% is losing 2 to 3% of real purchasing power every year. That means your $10,000 threshold is not stationary. It is moving away from you. Every year you are not crossing it. It is requiring more effective dollars to reach in terms of what those dollars can buy. This is the mechanism I have been warning about publicly for months. Financial repression. The government making the purchasing power of the currency smaller to reduce the real burden of its debt. And the people most hurt by financial repression are always the ones just below the threshold. The ones who are working toward the crossing point while inflation quietly erodes their progress. The implication of this is important, and I want to state it directly. Crossing the $10,000 threshold in 2026 requires not just accumulation of nominal dollars, but accumulation of purchasing power. The assets you choose as the destination for those dollars matter in ways that they did not matter as much in previous low inflation environments. A savings account earning 4% in a 6% inflation environment is not an investment. It is a slow loss. A money market fund earning 4.5% is marginally better, but still a real loss. The assets that preserve and build purchasing power in the current macro environment are the ones I have been discussing across multiple contexts. Assets with genuine scarcity, whose value does not depend on the government maintaining the purchasing power of the currency. I want to be specific about this for someone at the early stages of crossing the threshold, because the advice for a $10,000 portfolio is different from the advice for a $10 million portfolio. For someone building toward the threshold, the appropriate allocation has two components. The first is a liquid emergency buffer, earning the best available rate, not invested, liquid, accessible. This is your protection against the emergency fund trap I described earlier. The second is a small but growing position in assets that preserve purchasing power against the inflation mechanism that is actively working against your accumulation. Physical silver at current valuations. A small gold position. Commodity-linked assets. The specific percentage matters less than the principal. Some portion of your growing investable capital should be in assets that rise in value when the dollar loses purchasing power, rather than assets that lose real value when the dollar loses purchasing power. Now I want to talk about what happens after you cross the threshold, because the $10,000 threshold is not the destination. It is the beginning of the acceleration curve, and most people who cross it do not accelerate because they do not understand the next threshold. The next threshold is $50,000. At $50,000 invested at 8% annual return, you generate $4,000 per year, $333 per month from your capital without any additional contribution from your labor. That is the point at which the returns on capital begin to be genuinely meaningful in terms of monthly cash flow. The time to reach $50,000 from $10,000 at $300 per month additional contribution plus reinvested returns is approximately 6 years. Not 30, not 20, 6. The acceleration between $10,000 and $50,000 is dramatic because the returns on the initial capital are being reinvested while new contributions continue. And from $50,000 to $100,000 with the same mechanics takes approximately 4 years. The curve is bending sharply in your direction by now. Let me show you what this looks like across a realistic 30-year timeline for someone starting from zero with a modest savings rate. Year 1 to 3, pushing through the early stage below the threshold. Year 3, the $10,000 threshold is crossed. Year 5, approximately $25,000. Year 9, approximately $50,000. Year 13, approximately $100,000. Year 20, approximately $250,000. Year 30, approximately $500,000 to $700,000 depending on returns. These are not extreme numbers. They are the documented outcomes of people who cross the threshold and maintain the discipline. The reason most people do not reach them is not insufficient income. It is crossing the threshold and then spending the accumulation before the acceleration can take hold. The pattern I have observed most consistently across the wealth building cases I have studied is this. People cross the threshold. They see the balance growing. They feel wealthy for the first time, and then a significant expense arrives. A car, a vacation, a home improvement, and they spend the accumulated capital because it is there. They go below the threshold. They restart. This restart cycle is the single most common pattern in failed wealth accumulation, and preventing it requires one specific structural decision. Once you cross the $10,000 threshold with genuinely investable capital, those dollars need to be in a vehicle that creates friction against withdrawal. Not impossible to access, but not as easy as clicking transfer on a banking app. The psychological distance between the account and the impulse to spend it needs to be real. A brokerage account is better than a savings account for this purpose, not because of the returns, but because of the friction. Selling positions, transferring to a bank account, and then spending takes time and creates decision points. Each decision point is an opportunity to not spend the accumulation. A savings account transfer happens in seconds and creates no decision points. I want to close with something that I think about often when I consider how to communicate financial principles to people who are not professional investors. The economy is a machine. It has inputs, outputs, and cycles. And like any machine, it produces different outcomes depending on where you insert yourself into it. Most people insert themselves into the economy exclusively as labor. They sell their time, receive dollars, and spend those dollars on consumption. The machine processes them and returns them to the beginning of the cycle. The people who build wealth insert themselves into the machine in two places simultaneously, as labor and as capital. They sell their time and they also own a small piece of the productive capacity that their labor and everyone else's labor is generating. The $10,000 threshold is not a magic number. It is the minimum meaningful entry point for inserting yourself into the machine as capital, at a scale where the capital position begins to contribute measurably to your financial progress. Below it, the capital is there, but its contribution is so small that it requires extraordinary discipline to maintain. Above it, the contribution becomes visible and self-reinforcing. I lost everything in 1982 and had to borrow $4,000 from my father. The threshold I needed to cross then was the same threshold I am describing to you now. I crossed it eventually through the discipline that failure forced on me. You do not need to fail catastrophically to learn what I learned from that failure. You need to understand the arithmetic, understand the mechanisms that prevent crossing, and make a structural decision today that begins the accumulation regardless of where you currently stand. Comment below right now and tell me this honestly. What is your current investable balance, excluding emergency funds and retirement accounts? Just the number, not a story, not context, just the number. Because the act of stating it publicly is the first step toward understanding which side of the threshold you are on and what it would take to cross it. Subscribe. Share this with one person who is working hard and saving carefully, but has never had anyone explain the threshold mechanics I just described, and go make a decision. The machine is running whether you are positioned correctly or not. The threshold is crossing whether you understand it or not. The only variable is whether you are on the right side of it.